Well, we are in episode 3 of our series, ReThink Religion. And from the very beginning, what we've said from the very first week that we started, we've said that when Jesus showed up, he tried to make things really, really simple for us. But the church has a tendency to make everything complicated for people. And Jesus didn't do that. In fact, in week 1, what we saw was that Jesus extended a simple invitation, the same invitation that he extends to you and to me today. And that is just for us to follow, to stick close, to stay by, to watch what I'm doing and listen to what I'm saying. And what we saw was that the next step that happened, that following led to believing. And we talked about what it means to be a follower in that time and what it means to be a follower in the culture that we live in today. And there's some of you who are watching us today and you're a follower. That's what you're doing, is right now you're following. Because follow means don't ask me to do anything hard. Don't ask me to give anything up. Don't ask me to do anything complicated, but I'm interested. I want to know more. So I'm going to follow. And Jesus' initial invitation, back then as it is today, is simply for us to follow. And this interesting thing happened that as people stuck close to Jesus, as people began to follow him, they began to believe the things that he was saying. Not just the things that he was teaching, but they actually began to believe that he was who he said he was, and that he was going to do everything that he said he was going to do. And they began to believe that Jesus really was the Son of God. And what those of us who have followed for a long, long time know is that as you follow, you come to this kind of light bulb aha moment. And that was the pattern. It was the pattern back then, it was the pattern today. That as we follow, there's a moment where we actually start to believe. And so in week 1, we said we start with follow. And last week, we saw that following leads to believing, that believing is the natural result of following. And so today, as we close out our series, we're going to talk about a word that's kind of a sticky word, and it's a word that has been misunderstood and misapplied by pastors and church leaders. The word that we're going to look at today is obey. Obey. It's the do part. It's the practical part. It's the things that Jesus wants you and me to actually do. The unfortunate thing is it's always been presented out of order. See, in the New Testament, in the part of the scriptures where we talk about Jesus, where Jesus' story starts, the people who followed and then believed, what they started to do is they began to do the things that Jesus taught them to do. They began to do what he said. They totally organized their entire lives around the teachings of Jesus. And so they changed the way that they did money. They became extraordinarily generous. They changed the way that they related to their family. They treated their families better than they treated themselves. They wanted good things to happen for their enemies. And this reordering of their culture was curious to the Jews, and it was curious to the Romans who were on the outside looking in at this group. And over time, Christianity caught on and spread like wildfire. Not because of any rock star preachers or because of any public ministries or any fancy marketing campaigns. The reason that Christianity spread was because the lifestyles and the behaviors of the people who said, you know what? We followed Jesus for a while. We ended up believing that he was who he said he was, and that he would do what he said he would do. And now we trust that Jesus has what's best for us in mind. And so we're just going to do what he says. We're just going to do what he tells us because we're already so grateful for what he's done. And we're going to trust him that the way that he says that we should live life is going to be the best way. And it was so contagious. And it was so overwhelming that it turned the Roman Empire upside down, not because of an army, not because of incredible leaders or incredible leadership, but because of the lifestyle of this small group of people who said that I believe and I want to be like Jesus. And even though it was countercultural back then as it is today, and even though it didn't make sense back then as it sometimes doesn't today, they said, we're going to live our lives the way Jesus said to live our lives. And when they did that, And for some of you, when you did that, when you made the decision that you were going to live your life the way Jesus said to live your life, you felt incredible peace. You were no longer afraid to die. You became incredibly generous. You became so kind. And you had this incredible conviction about who you are, who you have faith and trust in. And it was so overpowering that eventually Rome, the empire that made Christianity illegal, eventually made Christianity its official religion. Religion, simply because a small group of people decided to obey the teachings of Jesus. Now, unfortunately, when many of us started going to church, when many of us started making our connection to God, the first thing that we heard wasn't follow. The first thing that we heard wasn't believe. The first thing that we heard was obey. Hey, we're glad you're here, now obey. Hey, welcome, now obey. Hey, listen, we don't even know your name, but obey. We don't know anything about you, but for goodness sake, if you are going to be here in this building with us, you've got to obey. And if you don't obey, then get out of here and don't come back until you're ready to obey, until you can figure out how to obey. And listen, some of us, that's been our experience. Maybe for some of you, that's been your experience. But that was never the experience all throughout the Bible. Whether we look in the Old Testament, the part of the scriptures that was written and happened before Jesus was born, or we look in the New Testament, that was never the pattern. And in any other area of our lives, we don't do this. Every other area of our life, we understand. There's none of us that have a relationship where we met the person and we said, listen, here are my rules. If you want to be friends with me, this is what you've got to do. Right? None of us started any of our relationships that way. How did our relationships start? They always started with spending time together, with sticking close together, with one person following and then following back. It was spending time together. And in that time that you spent together, as you spent more and more time together, as you saw what the other person did and listened to what the other person said, trust began to build. And so you went from following, from sticking close together, to actually building trust in your relationship. And as that trust began to build, what you saw was that there was something that you could do to make that other person happy, to serve that person, to bless that person. And they saw the same things that they could do to bless you and to bring happiness and joy into your life. And you began to do that for each other. That was the obey part. It started with follow, it came to believing, and then obeying. And yet churches have gotten it so wrong for so long. There is probably the most famous list of rules ever written, and many of you know this, the 10 Commandments. And if you don't know the story, if you've never read the story, then probably many of you have seen the movies, right? The Charlton Heston movie from long time ago to the more modern movies that have come out recently. We have heard the story of the 10 Commandments. Even if you're not a Christian, you've probably heard them. But here's the interesting thing. If you read that story for yourself, if you actually read exactly what happened, do you know when God gave the people the 10 Commandments? Do you know when it was that he gave them to them? Because he didn't give them to the people on day one. He didn't meet them and say, here are my commandments, right? He gave those commandments to a group of people that he miraculously led out of Egypt, that he miraculously led across the Red Sea, a group of people that he fed in the desert, a group of people that he provided water for in the desert, a group of people that he led them safely by day, that he gave them a pillar of fire to follow by night. And after weeks of giving and providing and protecting, he finally gathered these people together and said, listen, now that we have built this relationship, I want to tell you how to best live your life. And here's a group of people that God didn't ask them a thing for when he gave them his law. And when he did, they said, yes, we believe. We believe that you love us. We believe that you're taking care of us. We believe that you have our best interest in mind. And so, of course, when you tell us how to live our lives, we want to listen. We know that you want what's best for us. And God says, listen, I am telling you this. I'm giving you this list. I am telling you how you should live your life, not so that you can earn my love, but because you already have my love. That's why I want to give it to you, because I am the creator of life. I am the creator of everything, and I know how everything works best. So if you have followed me, and you have seen me, and you have heard me, and you have built trust in me, now would you consider obeying? Would you just consider following these guidelines? Because I know what is best for you. And this was always the pattern in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, all throughout Scripture, and all along the timeline from the end of Scripture up until today. This is the pattern that followers of Jesus have always followed. And I don't know how the church got it so backward and flipped it upside down. But Jesus' initial invitation has always been to you and to me. Very simple. Would you follow? Would you stay close enough? Would you stick by me and watch and listen? And listen, if you do that, there's going to come a point where you will naturally start to build trust in me, and you will believe. And once you believe, once you begin to see that I have what is best in mind for you, then maybe you'll consider the obey part. Maybe you'll consider making some lifestyle changes. Maybe you'll consider organizing your world around the teachings of Jesus. And listen, I get it. This is where a lot of people stop. This is where a lot of the people say, no, I'm gone. You know, the rails just, the train just goes off the rails. Right? Because, listen, the follow part, I can do that. And the believe part, yeah, it comes naturally. But the obey part, man, that's kind of tough. And see, Jesus understood this. And so at the end of his most famous sermon, a sermon that we call the Sermon on the Mount, which was a sermon that was full of the to-do stuff, he gave this parable. And here's what I want you to hear today, because it's so important. And because it's so misunderstood. But it is the to-do part, it is the obey part that makes the practical difference in our lives. You see, Jesus told this parable to a group of people who had already been following. Jesus told this parable to a group of people who already started to believe. And he wanted to give them the proper context for when God finally asks us to obey. And what this parable teaches us is this, is that obedience is what makes the practical difference in our lives. See, following is great because following leads us to a place of belief. And believing is great because believing gives us peace. Believing reminds us that we are connected to God through Jesus. There's a peace that comes with that. But the practical difference in your life, the practical difference in my life doesn't come from following. It doesn't come from believing. It comes from the obeying. And Jesus says, listen, okay, you followed, okay, you believe. Now, if you want to see a practical difference in your life, if you want to see a change in your life, you have to obey. And so in Matthew's account of Jesus' life, in the 7th chapter, Jesus is talking and he's presenting this new list of ideas to the people who are listening to him, right? He is presenting to them a new value system, a new way of living. And he says, listen, what you thought before is going to be different. This is how you should live your life. If somebody hurts you, turn the other cheek. If someone asks you to do something for them, do more than they ask you to do. If someone asks you for something that you have, give them more than you're asking for. Listen, God knows what you need. You can't outgive God. So if somebody asks you, give. Listen, forgive everybody. And every single time. Just forgive. And I know that's hard because we feel like if we forgive somebody, it's like letting them off. You know, like letting them off the hook. But Jesus says, no, listen, forgive everybody. And forgive them every time. Listen, when someone has wronged you, What you've always done is you've waited until they came to their senses and they came to you and apologized. No, that's not what we're going to do anymore. Now when someone wrongs you, I want you to go after them and make it right. I want you to treat everyone that you meet the way you would want it to be treated. And then he doesn't even stop there. He makes it tougher. He says, listen, you thought adultery meant you had to actually do something? No. Just thinking about it, that's already a sin. And the people must have listened to this. As maybe some of you are listening to this right now and you're thinking, come on, who can do that? That's too difficult. Can anybody really live like that? And I think the natural question that comes is, if we can't live like that, then does that mean that God is going to be mad at me if I don't do that? Is God going to be mad at me if I don't go the extra mile? Is God going to be mad at me if I don't give more? Is God going to be upset with me if I can't live up to that? And I think God would say no. Listen, I'm asking you to alter every area of your life, to look at every facet of your life and see how you can align it best with my teaching, not in order to make me love you, but because you love me and I love you so much that I know what is going to make your life better than you could ever imagine. And if you're thinking that this is hard, Jesus thought, listen, I know. In the same way as you're thinking, man, that's difficult, when he was giving this original parable to the people in that original time, when he said it to them, he knew that they were thinking the same thing. And so this is what he says. As he gets to the very end of his sermon, this is how he closes it out. He says, Therefore, after everything that you've heard me say, after all of these new things that I've talked to you about this completely new way to orient your lifestyle, he says, therefore, after all that, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice, see, what Jesus is talking about now is not the believing, it's the doing part, right? We don't get credit just for showing up, and that's difficult because in our culture right now, that's what we get credit for. Right? There's a I showed up mentality. This parable teaches the opposite thing. It's not just about showing up. See, Jesus was talking to the people and he said, listen, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're listening. You're following. I'm glad. I'm glad you're paying attention. But don't misunderstand me. What I'm talking about now is not the following and it's not the believing. This is about doing. So he says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice, and listen to what he says, is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And when he said that, here's what all the people thought. Well, of course. I mean, everybody builds their house on the rock. And Jesus is saying, listen, everyone who leaves this message today and does what I taught is smart. If you reorder your life around these teachings, that's the wise thing to do. If you rethink how you're doing your life and rearrange it around what I just taught, man, that is common sense. Now listen, this was back then, and maybe even today, an arrogant thing to say, which means every one of us has to make a decision. And listen, this decision isn't about heaven and hell. This decision isn't about, does God love you? Or is God angry at you? This decision isn't about being a good person or a bad person. This decision is about Jesus. Sitting down with you at your kitchen table, looking across the table at you, eye to eye, and saying, listen, if you will do what I told you to do today, if you will reorder your life around the things that I have taught you today, if you will just obey me, it's the smartest thing that you could ever do. It's the wisest decision that you could ever make. It will set you up for success in every single area of your life. It will set you up for success financially. It will set you up for success in your dating life. It will set you up for success in your marriage. It will set you up for success in your family life. If you do what I say, you are like a person who uses their common sense and builds their house on a rock. Now, this isn't a threat. This isn't a, listen, if you don't do it, God is going to get you. That's not what he's saying. See, this is how Jesus creates the context and explains to us what the significance of obedience is. And for many of you, you know the rest of the story. You've sang the song, right? The rain came down, the floods came up. In this translation, it's the rains came down and the streams rose. And the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. And when people in Jesus' culture heard this, they said, duh. I mean, of course, because that's why you build your house on the rock. This is exactly what will happen. This is common sense. This is wisdom. You know, this is what you know you're supposed to do. And Jesus is saying, look, by telling this parable and speaking it that way, he's saying, look, listen, doing what I taught you in the areas of life that I talked about is just as wise and practical and as commonsensical as building your house on a rock. And the things that I've taught you in the areas of love, and life, relationships, business, enemies, friends, I am equating all of those things that I taught you with the common sense, practical thought of building your house with a proper foundation. And just like a house built on a rock, built on a proper foundation, so your life will withstand the storms of life if it is built on the proper foundation. See, he's not talking about obey on Monday and by Friday everything's fine. You know, by the weekend your life is completely different. That's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is something that is not the results of weeks or months or even years. It is something that is a result of an entire lifetime. That Jesus looks at you and me and he says, listen, I am not looking at this week. I am looking at your entire life. Right? In this world, we're going to have trouble. That's what the scriptures tell us. We're going to have marriage trouble. We're going to have financial trouble. We're going to have kids trouble. We're going to have business trouble. We're going to have parenting trouble. Listen, name the category. We're going to have trouble. It's all a part of life. Because we know life is tough. Life is tough on everything. But Jesus is saying, listen, but if you will organize your life around my teachings, the storms are going to come. And you might get tossed around a little bit. But you will stand. You won't fall. Not because you are in church every week. Not because of your thoughts. Not because of your intentions. Not because of the promises you made. But because of a lifestyle where you practice what Jesus has taught and asked us to put into practice. He goes on and he says, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And I can imagine that the people who were listening to this are thinking to themselves, foolish man? I mean, who are you, really? You're telling us that if I don't listen to everything that you say to do, that I am foolish, that we're fools? Now listen, you and I, we miss this sometimes. You know why? Because we've seen beautiful beach houses. Right? We've seen houses on the beach. I love houses on the beach. You walk out the back, there's a porch, sometimes there's a pool, you step off of that, and then you're on the beach, and then to the ocean. And because we can build houses anywhere today, sometimes this parable gets lost on us. Right? But you see, back then, it wasn't the same way that it is today. And the guy that builds his house on the beach, listen, that guy, he builds his house a lot quicker. That guy doesn't have to build a foundation. He's building right on the sand. He doesn't have to dig a trench. He doesn't have to move things around. He is building. And by the time he is done with his house and he's moving in appliances, the other guy who built his house on the rock, man, he's still setting up his foundation. And Jesus is saying to ignore my teachings is like building your house on the sand. And in that culture, no one would ever think of building their house on the sand. And yet Jesus is saying, listen, as the one who created marriage, as the one who created life, as the one who created everything, to ignore my teachings is the equivalent of building your house on sand. And everybody already knows what's going to happen when you build your house on the sand. And so perhaps, yes, this is an extremely arrogant thing for Jesus to say. But maybe he's saying this because he knows. He's saying this because he knows what he's talking about. See, this is why obedience always follows belief. Because if you don't have that trust, then obedience is simply obeying for the sake of obeying. But when you do have that trust, then you know that these things aren't just random hurdles for you to jump over to see if you're good enough, but they actually make a practical difference in our lives. See, if you ask someone to obey you, if you ask for that obey part, and there's been no trust, when you're not even sure if you believe who this person is, they ask you to do something that is unusual and you think that person's crazy. But see, Jesus is talking to a group of people here who have already followed. They've already started to believe. And Jesus says, listen, if you trust me, if you believe that I have your best interest in mind, then I am pleading with you. This isn't about heaven and hell. This isn't about God loving us more or less. This is, in fact, because he loves us so much. And so his parable continues, and he says, the rain came down. And here Jesus is going to paint a picture where the person who built his house on the sand experiences the exact same storm as the person who built his house on a rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. And it fell with a great crash. And listen, in that audience, no one there was surprised. Because of course, that's what's going to happen when you build your house on the sand. Here's how Matthew, who was there listening to this and watching what was happening and watching the expressions on the people's faces as Jesus was speaking to them, this is what he would have to say. He said, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority. There was something about Jesus' words. There was something about his mannerisms. There was something about his presence that made him have authority. That when they listened to him and they watched him and they heard his words, that there was something about the way that he said what he said and actually what he said that made them say, absolutely, yes, I believe that. I'm going to do that. And their lives and their lifestyles completely turned the world upside down. Not because they followed, not just because they believed, but because they made the decision to reorder their life and their lifestyle around the teachings of Jesus, around this new value system, around this new way of thinking, around this new way of living. Now, this parable that Jesus told, that's the word I was looking for, told. This parable that Jesus told for us today, for me, for you. This parable comes either as a comfort or as a warning or as an explanation. See, for some of us years ago, we made the decision to reorder our world around the teachings of Jesus. And years have gone by. Some of you made this decision years ago. And as you look back on the time that has passed, you've seen that you've made it through some storms. And if people were to ask you, how did you make it through those storms? You would say, man, I don't know how I would have made it through if it wasn't for my faith in Jesus. I don't know how I would have made it through that illness. I don't know how our marriage would have survived. I don't know how I would have been able to deal with my prodigal son or my prodigal daughter. I don't know how I would have survived that horrible business deal. I don't know how I would have made it through except for our faith in Jesus. And I am so glad that years ago we made the decision to reorder and rearrange our lives to the best of our ability around Jesus' teachings. And when the storms came, as they always will, oh man, it was tough. But our lives, still here, we're still standing. And you would look back and you would say it's because of your faith. And I think Jesus would say, no, it's not just your faith. It's because of your obedience. It's because of your decision to live your life in a way that prepared you for the storms of life. And if that's you and you're listening to us today, then this parable is a comfort to you. Because listen, you started to come into church and your friends thought you were a freak, right? You became extraordinarily generous to people and your CPA thought you were nuts. You started pursuing relationships with people who don't even like you. And every once in a while, you'll start to wonder, is it all worth it? Is this going anywhere? And Jesus would say, yes, you're laying a foundation. You're doing exactly what your Father in heaven wants you to do. And so for you, this is a comfort. But for some of you, this parable is a warning. It's a warning because you know better than the life that you've been living. I mean, you enjoy the follow part. The follow part is nice, right? And you've had, or maybe kind of have had that light bulb on aha moment. You know, you're kind of starting to believe. I mean, you believe it's real. But when it comes to actually doing the do part, when it comes to ending that relationship, when it comes to doing business in a different way, I mean, your conscience is bothering you. But the idea of living the way that Jesus has taught to live is so threatening to you that this parable is a warning. And here's the problem. Right now, you look outside, there's not a cloud in the sky. It's beautiful outside. And your house on the beach, it's wonderful. There's no storm. There's no wind. There's no rain. And everything seems to be going fine. You're going to church every week. You know, you've made friendships. You're watching church every week. And you're feeling really good about this. And everything seems to be kind of working good together. And Jesus, who loves you, is saying, look, this is not about now. This is not about today. You see, I am looking at your whole life. And now is the time for you to regroup. Now is the time for you to rethink. Because we all know this. The worst time to rethink the foundation of our house is in the middle of the storm. Because when you're in the middle of the storm, right, when the rains come down and the floods come up, it's too late to do anything about your foundation. The worst time to think about where you're building your house is when there's a storm because it's too late. That's why some people come out of these messages sometimes and say, man, I wish I had heard that 10 years ago. I wish I had heard that when I was a teenager. I wish I had heard that before I got into that relationship. I wish I had heard that before I made that business deal. You know what they're saying? They're saying that I wish that I had laid a foundation for the last, 10, how many years? Because if I had laid a different foundation, then I would be experiencing something different today. It would be completely different. So for some of you, this is a warning. Not from a God who is waiting to punish you, but from a Savior who loves you so much. And He says, listen, this is the common sense thing to do. And if you will just embrace my teachings, you will be prepared when the storms come. And so for you today, this is a warning. And yet for others of you, this is an explanation. This is an explanation of what you're going through right now. It's an explanation of why you're back in church. Because the storms of life came and took you out. The storms of life came and everything fell flat. You thought your marriage was in great shape. You never thought you'd turn to prescription drugs. You always thought that you could beat alcohol and everything was rock solid, and then the storms came. And you look at your life and you're thinking, man, my dreams aren't coming through. And so you're back. And you might even be a little bit angry at God. You might have even said, man, God, I go to church and I pray. And the Jesus who loves you says, listen, that's great. I'm glad that you're doing that. But it is obedience that makes all the practical difference in your life. And so this parable explains why you're in the shape you're in. It's not about God's wrath. It's not about His punishment. It is simply a result of putting your foundation in a place that would never be able to survive a storm. But the great news is this, is that no matter where you are, God doesn't love you any less. And with God, it is never too late. And it's why so many people come to faith in a crisis. It's why we've seen throughout this pandemic so many people start moving towards faith. Because when we realize that the foundation that we've been building on isn't supporting us anymore, we start to look elsewhere. And so the question for you, the question for all of us, is simply this: who do you trust? Do you put your trust in culture? Do you listen to culture and when it says this is how you do your marriage, this is how you raise your kids, this is how you handle your money, this is how you live your life? Or do you do the bold thing and reorganize and rethink and place everything in alignment with the teachings of Jesus? And say, I am not going to live my life my way anymore. I am going to adopt your view, Jesus, your view of morality, your view of business and finance, your view of how the world is supposed to work. And I am going to learn to be obedient to your word. And folks, let me tell you, it was that kind of obedience that captured the attention of the world 2,000 years ago. It's the kind of obedience that still captures the attention of the world today. It's the kind that leaves people with no regrets. And it's the kind that when the storms of life come, which they will come, that you will be prepared. And yeah, the rain's going to come and the winds are going to blow. And there's going to be some shaking and rattling. But at the end of the storm, you'll still be standing. Obedience, following the teachings of Jesus, is what makes the practical difference in yours and mine, in our everyday life.